everything you're doing to make this visit such a blast. So I had a lot of meetings yesterday that kind of changed a little bit my plans on what I would discuss today. And I decided to discuss some general ideas about how we are using networks to map the information environment. And then I got stuck on this word environment, right? Sometimes also known as ecosystem. And we all talk about it. We all talk about trying to understand the current information environment, information ecosystem. But it's not really clear to me what we mean by that, really, right? We could conceive of this as an attempt to map the information environment like we map territories, right? And we could build topographical maps of the information environment using contour lines to sort of assess really features, which in this context could be proportional, for instance, to the size of the audience of a particular cluster of sources of information. There is a sociologist, James Moody, who actually did something similar with the landscape of scientific collaborations. In 2004, he wrote a paper in which he introduced the use of contour plots to map co-authorship structures. And he has used it since to sort of uncover hidden patterns in the evolving landscape of academic production. And so, he interprets this plot, for instance, this plot on the right, as showing that the field of social science is dominated, and I'm quoting, in the Northwest by the twin peaks of economics and law, and then to the Northeast of economics, we have political science. And then he shows a three-dimensional image of the same figure in the same paper to emphasize the relative height of the economics, law, psychology, and political science mountains. And he adds, and I'm quoting again, "It is easy to get a sense of the source of some of the self-abuse sociologists layer on our discipline compared to our mighty neighbors," because he writes, "Sociology appears a comparatively small foothill. The height of our neighbors results from their strong boundaries," by which he means that these other disciplines are better at citing each other than we sociologists are, who are overexpansive in our citation patterns. And this means that we are we have a blurrier identity as a discipline. Anyway, the point that I want to make with this is that when we talk about the information environment or the information ecosystem, we could be trying to produce this type of mapping. Maybe we should, but that's not what we are doing, right? Another approach could be analyzing the information environment like we analyze transportation networks, sort of the infrastructure that allows people to go from source A to source B. But this really is not what we're doing either. Instead, what we do analyze is something more similar to migration corridors, which is something that some people do when it comes to tracking animals traveling patterns. This map is from 1979, and it's called Highways in the Sky, and it depicts bird migration routes around the world. And I think that this is really closer to what we actually do when we analyze the information environment. We analyze data about the routes or the paths that we follow when we seek information, without the benefit of an atlas sort of mapping the territory underneath these movements or these routes. And so, all these analogies are great, but the reality is that when we study the information environment, what we're really doing is something way more mundane, but also way more demanding in many ways and challenging, which is to try to measure exposure data, right? And this creates the sort of data structure that we refer to as bipartite network, right? Where people create ties to news sources as they consume information from those sources. And then, you can project the one mode network to identify clusters of sources that are consumed by similar people, or you can project the one mode network where you can identify clusters of people who consume similar sources. But here's the thing. Curation mechanisms like algorithmic systems of recommendation mess up our understanding of the generative mechanisms that explain these bipartite structures, right? That explains exposure to content, because it is not just individuals selecting news sources according to their preferences or in line with intentional information-seeking behavior. There is also this algorithmic mediation funneling people to certain sources. And of course, the operation of these algorithmic mediation changes across platforms, and it has different impact for different subgroups of people. And so here's what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk. I'm going to walk you through some questions, provide you some answers, and then discuss a few things that I'm still struggling with. And I think I'm not alone. We are struggling with many of these questions as we think about these issues. We've already covered the background, right? Careful with metaphors. They may not be very helpful in really pointing you to the right mechanisms and measurement strategies. And really the big question here is the analysis of information ecosystems as the place where supply and demand meet, right? We have started as a field to disentangle this complex interaction between social and algorithmic choices. I think we are still a little bit farther away from understanding the aggregate consequences of these feedback loops. I'm going to then provide some answers to some of these questions based on recent work. And I'm going to show you some work about what exposure to news looks like across platforms. I'm going to tell you some things about who is driving most of that exposure, which leads to what we call in one of our most recent papers, the puzzle of misinformation. So it's only a minority of people who are consuming most news, and definitely also who are proactively engaging with misinformation. And so that begs some questions about, okay, so who is generating all this observational data that we're analyzing, right? And how much can we infer from these slices of the population when it comes to those who are invisible in our data? And so the bottom line is that I am going to offer you some very high-level picture of this area of research to give you a sense of how we are unpacking this very complex information environment in which we live, and specifically the things that I think as a field we are still struggling with. All right, so let me start with the question of exposure and susceptibility. There is a growing body of work identifying the demographic correlates that explain who is more likely to engage with political information and political news, including misinformation, and sort of the types of behavioral interventions at the individual level that are more likely to be successful in discouraging engagement with false news. There is also this notion that conservatives, for instance, are more susceptible to political misperceptions, but of course, this could result from a higher prevalence of false claims that align with the belief system of conservatives. And so this would be a pattern that results from the environment, right? From the fact that there is more volume of false news that are appealing to conservative viewpoints rather than from any psychological propensity of conservatives as individuals. And I think this is what this paper by Kelly Garrett and Robert Bond suggests. And of course, this then takes us to the question of prevalence. You've probably heard about this paper at the point. So there's this other work that tries to assess the prevalence of misinformation on social media and sort of the broader information ecosystem. And when we look at the prevalence of news and false stories, we can identify, this is the level of analysis that allows us to identify pockets of unreliable news sources, and also who is more likely to gravitate towards those sources at the population level. And then we have research that looks at the aggregate effects of social and algorithmic processes of curation, effects that often arise as the unintended consequence of systems that are way too complex to offer simple stories of how individual behavior translates into collective outcomes. And so we have research, for instance, suggesting that when it comes to political content and political news, there is an asymmetry in terms of political bias. So again, there is more content circulating online that that leans in the ideological spectrum right and not left. And so the question is why, right? Is it because of platform mechanisms like algorithmic systems, or because of social mechanisms like different supply pipelines for that content, or different forms of selective exposure? And the truth is that we don't really know why, right? We identify the patterns, we're still thinking about why that might be the case. And so I guess one of my main points in this talk is that we can only identify these aggregate effects if we take into account the operation of the whole system, be that a platform or the entire information ecosystem, which is tricky because, as I said at the very beginning, we really don't have a map of this ecosystem and how it encourages people to go from one source to the next. And so we just have partial pictures of many of its moving parts. And so at this point of my talks, I usually always bring Schelling's micromodels and macro behavior. We were talking yesterday about the virtues of using simple models. Sometimes they are much better than messy data in terms of helping us clarify what's going on. And so if there's one thing that Schelling did in this book that is quite old already, but I mean, I was kind of obsessed with this book as a grad student. And so if there's any of you who haven't read it yet, you should read it. But so essentially what Schelling did in this book was to use a very simple model to argue that often when we analyze social systems, if we only pay attention to individual motivations or revealed preferences, through behavior that we can track, then we are unlikely to see or understand the aggregated consequences of these behaviors and sort of the resulting interactions, right? And so an important thing here is that these consequences may not be aligned with or explainable by the original intentions. And so what you see on the screen essentially is Schelling's classic model of racial segregation. It is a very simple model, but he showed two crucial things with it. One is that, again, aggregated patterns often arise as an unintended consequence of individuals' behaviors, which means that if we were to take a snapshot of the aggregated patterns, we would probably draw the wrong conclusions in terms of the generative mechanisms, right? So we see segregation on the aggregates. Of course, we assume that people are looking for segregation in their individual decisions. And so what he showed with this model is that sometimes they have higher levels of segregation that emerge as a result of this complex interaction between the density of the population, the structure of the interaction space, and then individual motivations, right? And then the second thing that he showed is that small differences at the individual level can make big differences on the aggregate in a way that we wouldn't be able to anticipate just by looking at the individual parts. And so the moral of the story here is that generative mechanisms cannot be always reduced to individual preferences. And this is why networks are so important, because they allow us to understand the impact that these interaction patterns, which we can represent as networks, have on overall patterns. I do feel like we are not paying enough attention to these in the study of the information environment and misinformation, and probably related to the fact that it's very difficult to measure many of these things. All right, so the first studies that I want to discuss were designed to analyze exposure to news. And the one part that I want to emphasize is how different these patterns of exposure look, even if you measure them in the same way, depending on the platform under analysis. And so these are the papers that I would draw from mostly. In the first paper, we analyzed exposure to news on the web through desktop and mobile devices using Comscore data. So this is commercially available data. In the second paper, we analyze exposure to news on Facebook. This is one of the Facebook 2020 papers that came out last summer. And so in both of these papers, we're analyzing the one mode projection of the bipartite structure that I began with, right? So here the nodes are web domains or URLs for the segregation paper. And then the connections encode how many people get co-exposed to a given pair of sources. And so with this type of structure, we can measure things like overall segregation at the level of ideological segregation, at the level of the entire information ecosystem created by a specific platform. And so this will be sort of like, we can calculate statistics that characterize the entire system, but then we can also measure things at the level of specific outlets or domains and sort of give us a more granular sense of audience composition. And so, those flows, right? Like how people, what kind of people flock to some sources versus others, and so forth. And so in the PNAS paper that we published in 2020, where again, we use web tracking data, we showed that these co-exposure networks are actually growing denser over time, but you only see this pattern if you incorporate to your desktop web browsing behavior based on desktop activity only if you incorporate mobile data, so access to news to mobile devices. And so what this means is that people consuming news, an important footnote, this is just a fraction of the entire population. News is not very popular content. Entertainment is way more popular. So it's only a tiny fraction of, a small fraction of the population that actively consumes news. But these people are consuming news more broadly in terms of what the sources are. And this is partly driven by an increase in mobile access. Another thing we did in this paper was to look at the ideological composition of the audiences of these news domains. And then we found evidence that of ideological sex selection to the extent that the more diverse, sort of the farther apart any two news sources are in terms of ideology, the lower the audience overlap, right? So this is evidence of selective exposure, but nonetheless, these are very dense networks. So people who consume news are very broad-reaching in their news consumption patterns. But we see something very different when we look at the Facebook data. These are two of the figures we show in the paper where we look at the same construct. So we have this measure of ideological composition for news domains, which is based on who is consuming or who is exposed to those news in terms of their ideology. And so the distributions look very different, right? And so the comparison, in the case of the Facebook data, we actually have three different types of audience measures, right? So we have this notion of the potential audience, so everybody who could potentially see a piece of content just because that was in their inventory. Then we had this measure of actual exposure, which is the information that users actually saw on their feeds when they were using the platform, which is a subset of everything they could have seen, mostly driven by this algorithmic content curation process. And then we have measures of all the content that people saw, what they decided to engage with. But the comparison between these three is really irrelevant at this point for the argument that I'm trying to make. I'm just really focusing on how different this distribution is compared to what we observed on the web, right? This is what we saw with the ComScore data. And so in this case, most domains are centered around 0, which essentially means that their audiences are very mixed. There's conservatives and liberals consuming most of these domains. And this is actually what we saw with the subset of Facebook users who also allowed us to track their web behavior, right? And so on your left, you have the distribution, the ideological distribution of domains on the platform. And here we have the ideological distributions of the news web domains that a subset of Facebook users who we could also track on the web visited. And so again, these distributions look very different. And so this begs the question, what explains this difference, right? Because the conclusions you draw in terms of what kind of information environment we are inhabiting, or more specifically, whether people are living in different information realities, the conclusions are very different when you look at two these pieces of evidence. And so, of course, this is a simple question that hides a lot of complexity because, again, it points us to the generative mechanisms. And so I think the most obvious reason why the data look so different is because they are generated by different populations, right? Again, far fewer people get exposed to news on the web because on the web, for the most part, people access directly to these news sources, whereas on Facebook, news are pushed onto your feed, whether you want to see them or not. So there's a higher level of incidental exposure when you're using social media compared to what happens on the web. So, these are very different environments. And then there's other differences, right? If we were to map the pipelines that produce the news that go into the web inventory, and then again, this is kind of the entire universe of every piece of content you could potentially see on the web, you only see a subset of that content. But the pipelines that produce that inventory are very different. There's an entire political economy behind how news organizations operate, what kinds of new news organizations are arising in the digital economy, how they attract attention, how traffic flows. And we are not looking at those pipelines, right? We're just looking at, okay, these are the URLs that people visited when they were online. And then from there, we try to infer something about the information environment. And of course, on Facebook, there's an entire different set of pipelines that determines what gets into the inventory of potential content that people could see. And the most important difference is that there is a network. There is a social network that is actually producing the content that is going to be fed into users' inventory. And that inventory is different for every user because their networks are different. And the sort of activity within those networks change from user to user. Whereas on the web, it's just one inventory for everybody. It's just you navigate that universe differently, right? And again, this is all invisible to us in the case of Facebook data because we didn't get access to this data. So we can't really understand from where exactly in the network certain URLs are coming, right? Where this information is concentrated. And we are also not doing this on the web because it's unsurmountable, right? Like sort of building a census of everything that happens on the web is kind of an impossible task. Regardless of these mechanisms that could potentially explain the differences, the patterns are clear. And what is really shocking, especially about the Facebook data, is that there are major asymmetries that, again, that are consistent with other asymmetries that have been observed in other work, especially when we talk about misinformation. And so what we do in this figure is look at the audience composition of untrustworthy domains and false URLs. And in this case, we are using Meta's third-party fact-checking program to identify false information. So it's anything that has been labeled as misinformation by this crowdsourced network of fact-checkers. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's what it is. So essentially, the density plots in panel A and B show that most domains that are categorized untrustworthy are favored by audiences that are predominantly conservative. To give you some numbers, about 76% of untrustworthy domains have audiences that are conservative on average, meaning their ideology scores are above the 0 line. And then when we look at in panel C and D, we change kind of the aggregate, the level of analysis. Instead of full domains, we're analyzing specific news URLs. And here we show that 97% of URLs that have been rated false have conservative audiences on average, which are pretty striking numbers. And then we see something similar when we look at the co-exposure networks. And so again, remember that in these networks, nodes are domains and URLs, and ties encode the number of users that are co-exposed to a given pair. In this paper, we analyze co-exposure networks as a way of determining whether we observe evidence of segregation, even if we know nothing about the ideology of the users, right? So the presence of clusters in these co-exposure networks is evidence of selective exposure in a behavioral sense. And so only after we build these networks and we identify communities using one of the Satana's community detection approaches, and we overlay the partition of ideological scores, we saw that there was a correspondence, that these clusters, that these communities correspond to our measure of ideology. And so not only did we see that the clusters are mostly populated by similar individuals in terms of, meaning these news sources are consumed by similar individuals in terms of their ideology, we observe again this asymmetry by which we have this community here that is extremely homogeneous in terms of the conservative scores. And this is also where most of the misinformation, as identified by third-party fact-checkers, resides, right? And so, again, what explains this asymmetry? I mean, I genuinely don't think that there's something wrong about conservative people, sort of beyond policy positions or whatever, but like it's nothing intrinsic about the psychology of conservatives that makes them engage. There's something about the information ecosystem that is rewarding in terms of visibility content that leans right, ideologically speaking. But we don't fully understand why. What we conclude in this paper is that the results that we observe on the aggregate are result from a combination of social and algorithmic choices that we cannot disentangle when we only have observational data. And this also results from the incentives that the platform creates for content generation and circulation. And so in this regard, the web as another information ecosystem has a very different set of structures and incentives and generates a very different sort of distribution of attention. And so just sort of to provide even more evidence that, there's other pieces of work out there that suggest that these patterns appear in other platforms. These two papers show that, there's also evidence of asymmetry in other social media platforms, Twitter, now X. And so this paper on the algorithmic amplification of the right on Twitter, in this paper, it was also a collaboration, I believe, between academics and data scientists working for Twitter before Elon Musk took over. But so essentially in this paper, they used a randomized experiment on the platform that assigned a randomized control group of about 2 million accounts to a reverse chronological content feed that was, because it was randomized, it was freed of algorithmic personalization. And so in their analysis, they show that in 6 out of the 7 countries considered, and I think this is one of the strengths of this paper, it goes beyond the US. In 6 of the 7 countries considered, the mainstream political right benefits, that's their conclusion, from higher algorithmic amplification than the mainstream political left, both in terms of legislators, of politicians, and in terms of news sources. And again, I was reading avidly the paper when it came out. I think I said maybe they explain why. And in the discussion section, they say, we haven't figured out why exactly, because obviously, there's not one algorithm that you turn off, these randomized control trials, there's no equivalence in terms of, oh, you take this pill and something will happen to you. I mean, what they deactivated is a massive system of algorithmic decisions. And so the conclusion in the paper is we don't know what part of this system is responsible for the amplification that we observe. The amplification is real, right? And then with some colleagues, we also published this paper where we also use Twitter data in the context of the Black Lives Matter protests. And again, we found that most of the news URLs that were shared on Twitter during this period of heightened political mobilization, you know, in the context of a movement with progressive goals, most of the news URLs also had a right-leaning slant. And so again, right-leaning sources gain more visibility during this observation period. This is purely observational, it's not an experiment. And so the sort of conclusions you can draw are more limited, but the patterns are again are consistent. And so, yeah, a combination of social and algorithmic choices is driving these patterns. But to me, another important question here is, and who is behaviorally creating these patterns? Right? Who are the people who are posting this content, retweeting this content, engaging with this content? And so, you know, again, there's a lot of consistent evidence out there suggesting that it's just a very small number of people who are producing most of these behaviors. And so I'm going to discuss a couple of papers now very briefly where we try to identify who is this group of engaged, his small group of engaged individuals. And so here what we are doing is shifting our level of analysis. Instead of paying attention to news sites, we're looking at the individuals who are creating these overlapping edges, right? And so in the co-exposure network, someone creates these connections between any pair of sources. And so now we're going to try to identify who these individuals are. And so what I'm going to show you in the next few slides come out of this paper that has been under review for so long that I really want to cry in front of all of you, but I won't. But so essentially here, we're looking for the demographic correlates of people who engage with news. And in this case, we're using another commercial source of data, Nielsen, which maintains panels that tracks people's viewing patterns when they're watching TV, and also they're tracking them on the web. And so unlike ComScore, the web data only includes desktop activity. So, you know, all these sources of data have good points, bad points. A good point in this data is that we can actually see what people watch on TV. And for the same people, we can also see what they do on the web. And because we could access a YouTube API, I don't know if that's even possible anymore, and we had URL level data, we can then go to the YouTube API and collect additional information about the videos that they were watching on YouTube while browsing the web. And so this gives us a more comprehensive view of the information environment. And, you know, because it's been published work already, we know that most people still consume their news from TV. And so any study that excludes TV news consumption is excluding the biggest part of the iceberg that is usually underwater, right? Like we're only looking at the tip of the iceberg if we only pay attention to social media. Most people still consume news on TV. And so in this particular panel, there's a subset of about 55,000 panelists that are also in the web tracking data. And so we focus on this subset. And so in the spirit of providing some sort of cartography of the information environment, this figure is one attempt to map such to offer such a map. And so here, for instance, we're looking at the relative prevalence of news content in viewing patterns on TV via YouTube for the same group of people. And so obviously not surprised here, news content is far more common on TV. It's about 25% of all the programs watched on TV fall in this news category, whereas when you look at YouTube data, the percentage is about 5%. So it's only 5% of the content that people watch on YouTube that would fall in the category of political content. Here we look at the fraction of panelists that consume more than one news channel or news website. And again, this is the building block. This is what explains the formation of those edges, of those ties in the co-exposure networks. And so again, TV dominates, but you know, there's only a certain number of people who cross-pollinate, so to speak, who watch more than one news channel. Same with the web, which again, it pales in comparison to TV news consumption patterns. And then YouTube is YouTube is still a tiny fraction of the news diets for most people. But unlike what we see with TV and news, there's a clear increasing trend in terms of prominence. But again, remember that this is only desktop data. So these are, at best, very conservative estimates of how much news people consume on YouTube. through their desktop devices. So again, it would be great if we could also add estimates based on mobile access, but this is what we have. This is where we look at, okay, so who are these people creating these co-exposure ties? This is one of the main figures with our findings. And so again, the point of this figure is to identify the demographic correlates. And so in panels A and B, we show the results of linear mixed effects models with two dependent variables. We have a binary vector measuring whether panelists consume news in each platform, and then we have a numeric vector counting the number of news sources that they actually consume in each platform. Then in panel C, we actually count how many panelists would qualify as avid consumers in the sense that they are consuming news across platforms, on TV, on the web, on YouTube. And as you can see, it's a very tiny fraction of the panelists who consume news across, less than 10%. And in panel D, we summarize the demographic profile of this small group, of this 10% of people. And so again, essentially those going online to add more news to their information diets are older, they are better educated, and they are disproportionately male. And then the question was, well, maybe there's a substitution effect going on here. Maybe, yes, these people are going across platforms to consume news, but the more time they spend on YouTube, the less time they spend watching TV. And that's what we try to assess here, where we confirm that cross-platform news exposure does not result in substitution effect. If anything, it's boosting the time that people spend consuming news. Okay, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the last paper, and then we can have a discussion. So we did some additional analysis with this data, paying attention specifically to misinformation, which is, again, a very small subset of all the political content that we identified in the web tracking data. For this paper, we didn't consider the TV data. And so here we talked about the puzzle of misinformation that really is more of a paradox in the sense that according to Nielsen's web tracking data, those consuming most unreliable content are also those consuming most news overall and who have a more diverse, ideologically speaking, news diet overall. And so these later two things, like consuming more news and more diverse news, are usually considered in the literature as good signs. You're a good citizen, you're keeping informed, that's great. But it turns out that these are the people that also get the maximum exposure to unreliable information, right? And again, this is web tracking data. This is not Twitter. This is not Facebook. And on those platforms, the dynamics are likely to be very different. This paper was recently published in New Media and Society. And so I wanted to give a shout out to Alvin Su and Tian Yang, who were my students. Now they are very serious professors. And this is our first figure. And so what I want to highlight from this figure is, well, first of all, something that is also not surprising to those of us who do work in this area, which is that there's only a tiny fraction of all panelists that are responsible for most visits to news and also most visits to misinformation. This is what we show in panel B. So essentially, 1% of all the panelists are responsible for about 43% of all news pages visits, but for unreliable news, that 1% is responsible for 65% of exposure to misinformation. In panel C, we show the association between the number of news, legitimate news, and the number of unreliable news pages that were visited by these panelists. And then in panel D, we show the distribution of time spent consuming news. For the most part, people consume very little time on news. Of course, there's a lot of outliers. And I guess it's good news that overall, they spend less time consuming unreliable news than legitimate news. And so here we look again at the individual level predictors of exposure to unreliable content. We use, again, mixed effects models. So we control, we used as fixed effects the user ID and the month to control for temporal heterogeneity. But so essentially, when we control for all the demographics that I showed you before were relevant in explaining exposure to news, and we're controlling for temporal heterogeneity, what we see is that people who consume most misinformation are also consuming more news and have more ideologically diverse diets. And so it's kind of, okay, so is that good? Is it bad? Read the paper and you'll find out that we don't actually know. So back to the beginning, I just want to talk again about the importance of the aggregate view, but also of kind of thinking a little bit systematically about generative mechanisms. If there is one thing we consistently show in these papers is that misinformation is a problem that affects mostly a restricted group of people that are very homogeneous, but also outliers in many ways. We also show that some platform affordances give more oxygen to this type of content. I definitely think Facebook, because of the way it is designed, and probably Twitter, and because of the, not only the algorithmic process of curation, but also the incentives on how content gets generated and distributed, they end up giving more visibility to sources that are misleading, sources that are way more peripheral on the web, for instance. And I'm not entirely sure if this is intentional. It's just the result of this complex structure of algorithms and incentives and platform design. But in any case, all of these are properties that characterize the information ecosystem. We are very unlikely to identify the source of a problem if we only look at individuals and we try to give them pills to inoculate them against misinformation, which is a very worthwhile line of research. It's very partial in the view it gives us of the complexity that characterizes the information environment. And of course, there's other factors that I haven't really talked about today that David and I are still struggling with. And, as part of this Facebook 2020 project, it's not only that curation mechanisms matter, there's also another part of the process that refers to diffusion mechanisms, right, and how content travels through these networks. So we are now working on a paper where we're reconstructing these diffusion trees or these diffusion events as diffusion structures. And so, the point is that exposure and understanding the impact of algorithms on exposure is only part of the process, right? We also need to understand the chain reactions that exposure triggers. And to finish up, I guess there's a couple of questions that I'm still struggling with. One is, most of us are using behavioral trace data to analyze these exposure patterns. And most of us know that most of these behavioral trace data, at least when it comes to political news and political information, is generated by a very small number of people. What does that mean about the measures that we're taking, right? What does that mean about the validity of those measures or their generalizability? But also, what do behaviors tell us about intentions or preferences, really, right? Like, it's a very noisy approximation to what people really want. And this is where behavioral psychology comes in and tells us, you shouldn't always pay attention to what people do. You should ask them what you really want, because we are very weak creatures that always end up doing things that are bad for ourselves, even if we really want to do something else. And so in this context, we may not want to spend so much time consuming low quality content. We may really want to eat our broccoli and consume proper news. It's just that it's so much easier to just give up and eat the fast food. But the other thing is that the information environment is a very complicated world, and our current maps of this world are very imperfect. And sort of they look to me like some sort of like these ancient world maps that ended in the Mediterranean, and like these would be the researchers, right? And we're all looking into that map that is a very partial representation of the entire landscape. And this is what we call the world now, but obviously it's not. And with this, I'm going to finish.
Thank you very much, Matt. Let's start in here, and then there's some that might want to chat, but
a question and then so the first question is, have you worked with anthropologists and historians? Because even though these are new mediums, and then the follow-up actually compares the ecosystem and to there. Would you be able to go back to
the map?
Or the, sorry, keep going. It's not 1, 2, 4.
Yeah.
So going back to the ecosystem thing, if follow looking at it, YouTube here, I guess the question is, what do you consider? Because if you look at entertainment and music, a lot of times, not even just they're sharing information that could be considered talking about. So they're looking at just the official sources that wouldn't really constitute people being consuming it. Not also to mention the ecosystem. People sharing things across platforms. So it may be actually sharing some stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just identified the holy grail. I mean, I wish I could do that. I wish all of us could track those spillover effects and sort of how some content that comes up in one platform ends up percolating in other platforms. It's a very good. I'm going to start with the latest, but it's a very good question. What counts as political? In this paper, we used 2 different definitions. One was simply based on the channel labels, like so people uploading videos, they kind of have some labels that they can tick on. This is political, this is not. And then we also did the same analysis where we actually, so we do have a list of news domains that are news domains, sort of that are considered news, hard news, and so we just sort of identified YouTube channels that corresponded, the CNN channel or the New York Times, whatever. And of course, again, none of these two measures is perfect, but the percentages are similar. Sort of the relative percentages are similar. The numbers change, but you get a similar picture. But of course, highly imperfect. What counts as political, right? And then obviously, yeah, what happens on YouTube ends up sometimes getting on TV. Like it's just we haven't devised measurement tools that allow us to track content. I mean, it's kind of very challenging to track how content travels from a platform to the next in a multimodal world, right? Very challenging. And as for but I wish I could do it, and I keep on thinking. As for the first question, I have not worked with anthropologists or historians, but why not? I would love to, right? And it feels like with Twitter data, we're doing archival research now because it doesn't even exist as it used to. It also in general, these platforms are changing so quickly that I think we should redefine what counts as archival research. And so, yeah, we are historians. But I think more generally, yeah, I mean, of course, it's we could learn a lot from those collaborations. So if you have ideas, let me know. Yeah.
Actual plot, like, is politics in the news, or is it like a separate thing? Like, yeah, because I can imagine like the Daily Show, entertainment plus politics, news, like sometimes Good Morning America has like fitness stuff on, or like like we interviewed some random person about snowboarding. That's not. I mean, that's news.
I mean, this relates to the question, right? What counts as political? And so here for the TV data, we use Nielsen categories. Like they classify the programs, and then within so within the channel you have programs. But also we haven't validated, right? And so we haven't actually watched the program to see, So yeah, no, this is a source of error potentially, and. I think I could envision a data-driven approach to identifying political content, like a classifier that doesn't only rely on the usual markers of what counts as news. And I'm sure you were thinking about that too, probably. But
so it's any misinformation on the news that can spread service or misinformation, but also could just be like.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so in the Facebook paper, we actually differentiate those things. So because we do have these classifiers where misinformation could be about politics, but it could be about health, or it could, especially in the COVID. But also, what's about health is political, as the pandemic showed. So we do have that in that Facebook 2020 project. Mostly, we're using the classifiers that the platform that Facebook developed. So it's also not like 100% transparency as to how those classifiers work. But no, I mean, these are construct validity questions that are super important. And sometimes you're very constrained with the data that you have, right? And so you have to use imperfect proxies, but we should keep on thinking about how we are measuring those things, absolutely.
So you showed us that the media consumption are pretty different from web and social media. Where on social media, it's affected by algorithms, social networks. We have a sense of what's driving the I could imagine somebody with for example, subscribe to the New York Times, just go there.
Yeah.
Also, it could be from some other sources.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have someone in the room who has done work about that, like search engines as an entry point to news. And I wouldn't say that the algorithms and the networks, the algorithms for sure, but so within the social media world, like there's a change of paradigm also, right? TikTok doesn't rely on the topography. Like my sense is that the first generation social networks use the homophily, sort of the structure, the social structure as a shortcut to recommendations, because the machine learning state of the art back when they started wasn't as good. And so you could infer more about what someone might like as a suggestion based on their friends than just like through these very kind of hardcore data-driven, let's see what the data tells us. But TikTok doesn't, I don't use TikTok, but like it doesn't, there's no network really in the same sense that the network is not producing the inventory, right? With TikTok, you have a single inventory for everybody, and then the algorithm tells you, you like this. And apparently it does also very well because it's very addictive. But whereas on Facebook, and Twitter, although it's different in different ways. The inventory is specific to the network of every individual, and of course, the users choose their networks, right? So it's not entirely algorithmic, but you also have people you may know recommendations that shape the structure of the network. So, but I think we're moving away from that paradigm. Well, the social media platforms are moving away from that paradigm, and the networks are becoming less relevant. That on social media. So even within the umbrella social media, I think algorithms always matter, but for different reasons. And on the web, of course, yeah, there's several entry points. I mean, search engines is one. And so another footnote here is that what's going to happen now that generative AI is going to change how we use search engines, right? But it's not the only one. And the data, these two ComScore and Tian Yang, my previous student, his dissertation was about entry point to news, and he used mostly the ComScore data. We also looked at this with Nielsen data, which again is social media data, limited. Well, it is what it is. But the main entry point to news is direct access. And then I don't remember now if social media, meaning, when you click on the link on YouTube or Twitter and then you go to the domain. So we don't track, with the Nielsen and ComScore data, you don't track what happens within social media, but you see the traffic flow that comes from them. And I think they were more important than Google search for this particular data set. But again, I think the behavior is entry points are very different if you're using your cell phone, where you also get alerts, versus your desktop, and the vast majority of databases on web tracking that would allow you to assess what's the main entry point, use desktop computers, which is totally kind of out of, it's an underrepresented, it's a very conservative estimate of actual flow. Yeah, so direct access is definitely not the only thing that matters for web traffic. But there are definite differences in how these flows of people going from one source to the other happen on the web because of the way it is built versus the design of social media platforms, right? And I don't think we even have a full census or mapping out of all the features and affordances and design choices that matter in determining this behavior, right? In the same way that we have maps of highways and how cities are connected, we don't have a similar kind of infrastructure mapping of how different or similar these social media platforms are, right? In terms of, and how that would impact the behavior. We just observe the behavior. Anyway, yeah.
Have you seen anything about potential duopoly and the social connections of people who consume more and broader range of information, both air quotes, true and fake news?
So what was the first part of the question? Do we have what?
Have you seen any evidence of like social duopoly in people who are consuming these broader like higher volumes of both true and fake?
You said social heterophily in terms of the network?
Yeah, like in terms of the person.
So again, one of the big flaws of this data is that, these are independent users. I don't know how they are connected. For the web tracking data, it's kind of like with survey data, you just have individual sort of independent units of observation. With Facebook, we could. One of the things we wish we could do. There's this notion of information corridors, right? Like, so when it comes to misinformation, we do know it's a small fraction of the user base that are very proactively pushing misinformation on Facebook. We don't know if they are all clustered in the same part of the social graph, if they are scattered randomly around. My suspicion is that there's a movement component to this, meaning these are coordinated information efforts. Maybe not all of it, but a huge part of this, which would imply some sort of coordination, implies some level of connectivity. It's all intentionally, designed to kind of make certain sources more visible or not. I don't have the data. It's pure speculation. My sense is that the networks matter a lot in that context, but we just don't have that data. David, would you agree with that?
I think totally. One other thing I want to say in terms of affordances was especially what we found in the mobile pages driving segregation of news consumption. That is, people, you may not select friends because that's what they align with you. But if you're following a political page, it's because it produces content that is aligned. So there's an interesting question of the different entities, different creatures on these different platforms. So this goes back to what you're saying on affordances that it's clear that pages in some groups drive getting exposed to more like-minded content than your friends are, because you may be friends or
sometimes family, with people who have very different.
It's a higher order definition of homophily, kind of like, because on Facebook you have the homophily intrinsic in social networks, as in, birds of a feather flocking together, but also you have these pages and these groups that are kind of homophilous, but not requiring personal connection. You just hang out with people who are similar to you, hang out, but you may not know each other in real life, right? And that was an add-on after. But also these pages in this group, these pages are, again, there's many pages that have the same administrators, right? Again, coordination attempts at controlling information flows, right? So you have the same administrators pretending to be different pages, but they are all like pushing the same information kind of semi-simultaneously to create the illusion that something is viral, but it's actually coordinated. And we don't know how much of that, how prevalent that behavior is. I just suspect it is, it exists. But we don't know because we don't have the network data. So unfortunately, there's no answer to your question, although I think we have good reasons to have some hypotheses there that would be great to test.
We have put to a question online and we can come back here, but Alyssa is asking, what do you think the role of metaphors in making sense of where we're at with respect to information consumption and quality? I'm particularly thinking about the pervasive use of marketplace-like metaphors.
I think metaphors are great, but they are also dangerous sometimes because we use them for their evocative power that allows us to crack a problem that is difficult to crack, or an entry point to think about, okay, how could we attack this problem? But they can be dangerous when you just they become conventional wisdom and so you just use them uncritically, and maybe they are taking your thoughts in the wrong direction. And so I think you asked this question because you have thoughts yourself about these metaphors. And so I would like to hear your thoughts about it. I don't have anything against metaphors. I think they're great as long as they don't deviate you from what those metaphors are trying to help you accomplish, which is understand something. And sometimes we just use metaphors as shorthands that kind of, we think we understand what we're talking about, but we're really not. And so there's an editorial part of me that's like, okay, what do you mean? Are you sure you understand what you mean when you use this metaphor? And we could even argue that some metaphors are used intentionally for ideological purposes. It's a marketplace of ideas. I don't know. I don't know if she has a mic or they have a mic, but maybe I'd like to hear the thoughts.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hi.
Hi. So I guess the way that I think about metaphors is sort of a way of enabling you to ask certain kinds of questions. And like, if you have, say, a marketplace metaphor, maybe you're going to ask more the kinds of questions that someone in economics would ask about. Whereas if you're using like an ecosystem metaphor, maybe you ask questions that are originally grounded in biology. So that's kind of what I was thinking with that. But I do think that there is definitely danger there where you try to shoehorn whatever data source you have, in this case, information consumption, into your metaphor a little bit too neatly.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at.
I agree. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Yeah. So when you said that people who consume more information, do you mean also the proportion of these articles they consume? Just like overall.
So people who are panelists in the Nielsen data that we can track for specific points of time through desktop devices, they do consume, but by that we mean they access more URLs to sources that are untrustworthy, and they spend more minutes or more seconds, depending on who, more time. They spend more time doing that, and that doesn't undercut the time they spend using, instead of consuming other sources. It boosts it, right? But it's kind of like a richer thingy where it's like, it's not that you have segmented audiences, some of which are consuming misinformation and some are consuming, it's the same group of people. And so the more, which makes sense. These are highly politically motivated, highly engaged, highly educated, probably bored, like older people who, they spend a lot of time consuming news. I think what's unique here is that our baseline is TV consumption. Everybody, most people consume news on TV. And so what differentiates you is whether you consume news also online and where online, right? And so for this paper, we only have web and YouTube data. and you know, and these are representative panels of the population. So of course, I mean, we're probably not tracking what the most extremist people are likely to do, because I don't know what are the chances of them volunteering to be part of this Nielsen panel. But the panel is weighted so that it's representative of the overall population. And so it's about the what we find is that, you know, it's about sort of digital technologies are boosting the time you spend consuming news if you're a specific type of person, which is older, male, educated, with certain level of income, blah, 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 right? But again, contingent on the data we're analyzing. And the one big dissatisfaction I have about this data is that it doesn't track mobile access to news. And so probably younger people, I mean, you know, it's noisy or kind of biased, not noisy only, it's biased, right? But that's what the data tell us. So. So we do have a baseline, you know. It would be nice to see on I know, David, you're doing research on Twitter, and I know you know that it's mostly women who are sharing most misinformation on Twitter, right?
That's right. Disproportionate women.
So yeah.
Which is not women. There you go.
But it's probably, you know, but that's because of, I mean, again, like how you use social media and how you consume news, and you know, it changes so much when you're on your phone, right? And so that's what we don't have with the Nielsen data. So I also want to be very cautious with how much from, I mean, yeah, anyway. Is that a hint?
No, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Any more in the room? Or what's on mine?
Is there certain differences in like behavior versus the data? So you can't necessarily get at sort of how incidental and sort of the various sites are, but like see that because I sort of thought that's my hand. That's like give arguments in the book that if you're on the limit and maybe something's like, oh, I'm actually going to be every day. But then you can imagine that maybe people more on Facebook. Anyway, just one thing. I guess they don't hit the main level. Access is.
Sort of diverse in terms of who does the.
In terms of like, if even one person's on Facebook versus on the web, like,
yeah.
what's the diversity of the link?
Okay. I don't think we have any figure on that. We do have a figure in the paper where we look at the top 100. Thanks for coming. Top 100 by views, domains by views on Facebook based on platform activity, and so this is kind of the most viewed domains, and then if you compare that list with the top 100 by views according to ComScore or Nielsen, there's a cluster of domains that, according to the Facebook data, are consumed predominantly by very homogeneous conservative audiences that don't show up in the top 100, right, in terms of the reach. So I know the diversity question was going in a different direction.